Hi, welcome back. If you remember, we were talking about the Manitowoc 2250. That's a crane model, not engine model. And this particular crane has a QSX 15. And the QSX is the ISX, but an industrial version. There are mostly exterior differences. And the engine was stalling. So this engine has a CM570 ECM. That's significant because the fuel system on this engine, the fuel filter, is a suction filter, the one on the engine. Whereas if you get the 870 version, that has a pressurized filter on the engine. So they kind of look identical almost to the eye. There's a few extra metal lines on the one that's got the pressurized filter. That usually also has fuel running through the ECM cooler plate, where the 570, the ECM was bolted on against an aluminum plate, and the aluminum plate had fins that actually went inside of a hole cast in the head, so it was in the intake airstream, and that's what cooled the ECM. So we've got the 570 with the suction fuel filter, and that's significant because fuel restriction numbers, maximums, are different for this than they are for the pressurized fuel filter or the 870. So the tech called me again, and I had told him I wanted him to hook a fuel restriction gauge up onto the IFSM, and he did, and the machine was running good, and all of a sudden the machine stalled, and when it stalled, the restriction gauge went up to 27 inches of vacuum. So if you're not familiar with measuring fuel restriction, anything over 12 inches is getting pretty extreme for the engine's fuel system. Most trucks run between 2 and 5 inches. Some of the machines can get as high as 12 inches. That would be the allowed absolute maximum with a dirty fuel filter. So this one was well over the maximum, and that's why the engine stalled. It just couldn't pull the fuel. So he's got to figure out what caused that. Some of the cranes have electric fuel pumps in the tank because the tanks are on the other side of the machine away from the engine. The fuel can go through piping, through multiple hoses, so he's going to have to figure out where the problem is. I told him I wanted him to hook a fuel line, number 10 Strataflex fuel line, on the IFSM at the suction port, the number 10 suction port where fuel enters the engine's fuel system, and throw that into a bucket, a 5-gallon bucket of fuel, and see if the restriction comes way down. And if it does, then he's going to have to start checking lines and maybe filters, or maybe even a piece of the piping on the crane got smashed. Stuff happens when they're assembling machines, you never know. So once I get the final update of what's actually the problem, I'll do a quick update. Here's an exploded view of a generic IFSM, and up at the top you see two beige arrows. That is the fuel restriction fitting on a non-pressurized fuel filter, which is what we have. So I told the tech to hook his fuel restriction gauge up there and start the engine up and rev it up, and his gauge went to 26 inches. Now if you look, non-pressurized fuel filters without a remote filter, you're allowed 3 inches of restriction. With one, you're allowed up to 10 inches. Some of these cranes, the engines are put in, and there's literally a steel wall or a cable drum right next to the engine. So you can't access the fuel filter in some cases. And they'll put a cap, a big steel or aluminum cap on that fuel filter housing instead of the filter, and they'll run number 20 lines, Strataflex lines, under the engine and up to the other side to a remote fuel filter. So if you've got that, you're allowed with a dirty filter up to 10 inches If the filter's on the engine, you're allowed 3 inches. If you've got the newer IFSM that has pressurized fuel filters on it, up at that fitting, your maximum restriction is 8 inches. And with a dirty filter or one you don't know how long it's been on the machine, it's 12 inches. Again, we were reading 25 to 26 and the engine would stall. The red arrows are where the OEM fuel line hooks up. That would be the fuel supply line. I call it the fuel suction line because the engine's sucking the fuel from the tank through that line. On some of the cranes, there's a screen in a tank. So he could have a problem in the tank with restriction. He could have a problem in the line. A lot of these cranes, because the tank is on the other side of the machine, there'll actually be some steel piping that looks like a water pipe going around the machine, and the fuel's in it. So if one of those gets smashed someplace, and they do when you're assembling, things happen, that can be a problem. So he's going to call me back probably in another week when he goes out to the job and figures out what the problem is that with where our restriction's coming from. But we do know that the engine is stalling because of restriction. I seriously doubt it's in the IFSM. It'd be very rare if it was, but there's a good chance that something's going on between the tank and the IFSM. Thanks for joining me. Talk to you soon.